Did you know you can do this with MIDI? If you want to do this with your music, stay tuned. Hey guys, Joey here, and in today's video, we're going to talk about MIDI. By now, you probably know how to use it to compose notes for software instruments. That's an essential part of working with MIDI, but it's not all that you can do. I'm going to show you 3 creative ways that you can use MIDI to get more out of your productions. Let's jump into it. MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, is a language that bridges the digital and analog world. Information is sent from a MIDI controller and interpreted by a number of sources. The most common use for MIDI has traditionally been sending note information to analog synthesizers like keyboards or drum machines. MIDI came out in the 80s, and since then, musicians have found a bunch of creative ways to utilize it. Each MIDI connection has 16 channels that each have their own CC values. These range from 0 to 127, which means parameters can be controlled with a lot of accuracy. These CC values can control how hard a note is hit, how far it is panned, how much the pitch bends, pretty much anything that you can think of. Okay, that's the basic layout of what MIDI is. Now let's use it to get creative. There's a ton of stuff that you can do by combining MIDI with a guitar amp. Stuff like patch changes, parameter adjustments, and entirely new creative effects can be adjusted automatically without ever touching the amp. This workflow is awesome for performing live. Most modern amps have a control pedal to affect the amp, and many of these actually send a MIDI signal from the pedal to the amp. If the amp has MIDI controllable parameters, then these parameters can be adjusted by running a MIDI track from a laptop to the amp. This has 2 advantages. All changes can be made with grid perfect timing, and multiple parameters can be changed at once. Whether you're adjusting these parameters with a DAW or a generic MIDI controller, there's a few things you need to know. Number 1, does your amp support MIDI? Most digital modeling amps like Axe-Fx or Kemper have great MIDI support. You can pretty much control any parameter available. What might surprise you is that many of the modern tube amps also have MIDI support. The options are usually limited to channel switching, but this can still be a really useful feature for automating a live show. The second step is to find out which MIDI channels do you want. For the traditional tube amps, this will usually be pretty easy since there will only be a few channels to worry about. With the digital amps, there can be way more parameters and might even require manual routing from the amp itself. No matter which head is being used, make sure to check the manual. If you want to control an amp that doesn't have MIDI jacks but does have 1/4 inch switch jacks, you can still program it with MIDI. This setup requires a converter box that turns MIDI information into an analog voltage. This is a great solution if you want to change the channels automatically. I'm not going to go into it with this video, but there are some great tutorials that show this in greater detail. Okay, so the MIDI channel has been identified. Now let's program some changes. I'm going to start by making a MIDI track in the DAW. I've connected a MIDI cable from the interface to the amp. I read the manual to find which MIDI channel changes the parameter that I want. Now I just need to write the change on the MIDI track and send it to the amp. Check it out. Awesome, now every time this song is performed, the amp will automatically change channels at this point. This is really cool when using digital amps. Just a few MIDI tracks can change the channel, the tempo, the delay speed, and the overdrive that are being used all at once. This is also a great way to change certain parameters without switching patches. On some modelers, patch switches cause audio dropouts, which can be avoided by adjusting parameters directly. If you're using a software amp like ToneForge, these changes are even easier. Just automate the parameter and it's done. ToneForge Jeff Loomis has a live mode where you can save presets, then use a MIDI controller to easily switch between them. This makes the plugin feel more like playing a traditional amp, but with even more flexibility. Writing vocal melodies with MIDI has many advantages. With practice, ideas can be laid down almost instantly. This saves time from having to record a vocal idea manually. Once it's programmed, any note or timing can be changed without having to edit an audio file. Not only does this save time, but it also sounds way cleaner than a stretched and repitched vocal take. And you can play any part of this right back to the vocalist while they're in the booth. Whether they want to hear 2 notes, 3 notes, the whole part, the beginning, the end, doesn't matter. To create this, I'll usually use some kind of synth with a timbre that mirrors the human voice. I want it to be pretty dry, so I won't use tons of distortion or reverb. Most of the time, a monophonic synth is going to sound the most similar to a voice. The attack and release can be adjusted to fit the vibe of the part. If a line is supposed to fade in or swell, a slower attack will replicate that. If the line is supposed to be staccato, then a fast attack and release will achieve a similar sound. A synth is often a better choice than something like a piano because the sustain can be controlled. I'll write a few notes and show you why this is helpful. Now that the MIDI is in place, a singer can perform over the synth. This is awesome because they can be guided by the MIDI performance to center their pitch and timing. If someone is having trouble keeping track of the pitch, or if you're writing and recording at the same time, this is a super useful guide to have. Once the vocals are recorded, these MIDI notes can be used to help tune the performance. Some tuning plugins can even read the target pitch right from the MIDI file. This saves time from having to choose the target pitch manually. If set up correctly, this is a really powerful approach for tuning vocals. Like the guitar patches, these can even be triggered live if an artist is performing with a tuning processor. Just make sure the artist isn't going to go too far outside of this pitch range or the results are going to get really weird. Composing vocals with MIDI is even more powerful when writing harmonies. It's easy to just duplicate this synth track and then work out different rhythms and notes to complement the main take or make offsets that create harmonies. There's a few really powerful ways to use MIDI with drum editing. The most common one is to use an audio to MIDI processor in the DAW to create something called key spikes. Step one with any kind of process like this is to make sure that every key spike is the intended hit. A loud tom on a snare track can create a MIDI note that isn't intended. Since it's MIDI, they're pretty easy to edit. Just listen to the track and make sure you see a MIDI note for every drum hit. Once the placement is correct, they can be used with a drum sampler to create velocity accurate drum hits. Having the velocity information is a great way to get an exact intensity with every drum hit. Higher velocities mean harder hits. Depending on the sample method, this could control the volume of a one-shot, the sample choice in a multi-sample, or the timbre of the hit in a sampler plugin. Another less common way to use MIDI with drums is to use the key spikes to control a gate on a real drum performance. Gating drums is a standard approach to reduce bleed and get the cleanest hits. The problem with traditional gating is that any noise loud enough on a track can cause the gate to open. If there's a particularly loud tom or cymbal hit on a snare track, well then the gate on the snare track is going to activate. This totally defeats the purpose of a gate since the track has to be manually cut anyway. This is where MIDI gating comes in. As long as the key spikes are accurate, they can be used to trigger many processes, including a gate. Not only does this keep the gate accurate, but it can also be used to control exactly how long the gate is open. Check out how much control I have over the note length just by adjusting my MIDI. If you've got a really tight drummer who plays the parts exactly as recorded, this MIDI data can be even used to trigger a gate live. This is really useful because bleed on live drums is almost always a problem and needs to be solved. MIDI gating can get you all of the accuracy from samples with the live drum sound. If they're trying to pull this off with a gate that can't read MIDI but does have a sidechain option, you can print these key spikes with a signal generator that gives a phase accurate sidechain. MIDI is a super powerful tool, and once you understand how it works, it can simplify so many tasks. From editing to mixing to live performance, MIDI is a great way to automate settings on a processor. Do you have a creative MIDI setup in your workflow? Tell me in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to check the links in the description below and tap that bell to get notified whenever we upload new videos. Until next time, happy mixing.